The DNA test seemed like a joke, until it shattered our family and uncovered a chain of betrayals. You know how they say some stories start with a bang? Well, mine started with forks scraping against a dinner plate and my grandma's crazy idea that would blow up everything I thought I knew about my family. Sunday dinners at our house were like clockwork. Mom would spend half the day in the kitchen, cursing at the oven timer and making sure the roast chicken came out golden brown. The smell would hit you the moment you walked the front door, that perfect mix of herbs, butter, and home that made you forget about Monday morning meetings and credit card bills for a few hours. I'm Mark, by the way, 35 years old, working in insurance, and up until 3 months ago, I thought my biggest problem was explaining to clients why their basement flooding wasn't covered under their standard policy. Turns out, life had other plans. Our dining room was this shrine to middle-class normalcy. Mom's china cabinet displaying the wedding set she only used twice a year. Dad's old baseball trophies from high school gathering dust on the mantel. Family photos where everyone's smiling like we're auditioning for a sitcom. You know the type, where everything looks perfect until you look closer and notice someone's eye is twitching. That particular Sunday in October, the leaves were doing their whole autumn show outside our windows. Grandma Helen was holding court at the head of the table, gesturing with her fork like she was conducting an orchestra. At 73, she had this energy that could power a small town and opinions about everything from a neighbor's lawn care to why young people don't appreciate good meatloaf anymore. My sister Lily was sitting across from me, scrolling through her phone between bites. At 32, she had this way of looking perpetually amused by the world, like she was in on some cosmic joke the rest of us missed. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she wore this vintage band t-shirt that probably cost more than my monthly gym membership. Dad was doing his usual Sunday performance, telling stories about a construction crew like they were characters in some sitcom. Mike's one of those guys who finds humor in everything, even when the contractor tries to stiff him on payment or when his back gives out from lifting too much concrete. He's got these weathered hands that tell 1,000 stories and laugh lines that run deeper than the Grand Canyon. Mom was different that day. Sarah's usually the conductor of our family symphony, making sure everyone has enough food, asking about work, remembering whose birthday is coming up next month. But that Sunday, she was playing with her napkin like it held the secrets of the universe, folding it, unfolding it, straightening the silverware that was already perfectly straight. I should have noticed. Looking back, the signs were there like breadcrumbs leading to a house made of lies. But who pays attention to breadcrumbs when you're focused on the destination? Grandma Helen cleared her throat, that theatrical sound she makes when she's about to drop one of her brilliant ideas on us. The kind of ideas that usually involve reorganizing someone's entire life or explaining why we're all doing everything wrong. She pulled out her phone, waving it around like it was Excalibur. One of those ancestry DNA test kits was sitting on the counter behind her, still in its box. The kind you see advertised between cooking shows and car commercials. The whole DNA testing thing had become this weird American obsession. Everyone's suddenly an amateur genealogist, discovering they're part Viking or related to some random Scottish clan. It's like fantasy football for people who peaked in high school history class. Grandma's eyes were sparkling with that dangerous kind of mischief. She explained how she'd ordered the kit online after watching some documentary about people finding long-lost relatives in Ireland. Her plan was simple. We'd all spit in tubes, mail them off to some lab in California, and wait for the internet to tell us we're secretly related to royalty. The idea hit the table like a comedy bomb. Everyone started joking about what they hoped to discover. I announced I was probably 10% coffee addict and 90% disappointment to my parents. Dad claimed he was descended from a long line of guys who fix things and complain about the weather. Lily dramatically declared herself a French princess who'd been tragically separated from her palace at birth. Even Mom cracked a smile at that one, though I noticed she was still doing that thing with a napkin. For just a second, her eyes met mine across the table, then darted away like she'd touched something hot. I should have paid attention to that moment, but I was too busy laughing. She twisted the cotton between her fingers like she was trying to wring answers from it. The laughter felt good, natural, Like we were a real family instead of people who just happen to share the same address and argue about whose turn it was to take out the garbage. But you know what they say about laughter. Sometimes it's just fear wearing makeup. Grandma Helen was in full sales mode, explaining how the whole process worked. Spit in a tube, wait 6 to 8 weeks, and boom, you'd know if you were related to George Washington or if your great-great-grandmother was actually from Germany instead of Poland like she claimed. The science fascinated me. DNA doesn't lie, unlike people. It can't embellish stories or conveniently forget important details. It just sits there in your cells, holding on to every secret your ancestors tried to bury. We all agreed to do it. Why not? What's the worst that could happen? We'd find out we were slightly more Irish than we thought. Maybe discover some distant cousin in Oregon who collected vintage teaspoons? The testing process was surprisingly simple. For little tubes, for people spitting into them like we were participating in some weird family ritual. Dad made jokes about how this was the first time anyone had paid him to spit. Lily took a selfie with her tube, captioning it something about unlocking her ancestral mysteries. I remember thinking how modern families had gotten so complicated. Previous generations never questioned their stories. If Grandpa said he was from Poland, you were Polish. End of discussion. But we're the generation that needs proof of everything. We track our steps, monitor our sleep, and apparently sequence our DNA to make sure our family tree isn't growing crooked. The weeks that follow were normal. Work, bills, weekend barbecues, and the usual family drama about whose turn it was to host Thanksgiving. I'd almost forgotten about the DNA test until I got the email saying my results were ready. It was a Tuesday evening in November. I was in my home office, surrounded by the accumulated debris of adult life. Insurance manuals, coffee stain reports, and a half-dead plant that Lily had given me as a housewarming gift 3 years ago. My computer screen glowed in the dim light as I logged into the Ancestry website. The ethnic breakdown looked about right for a guy whose family had been bouncing around Europe before landing in Ohio. Then I scrolled down to the relatives section. That's where everything went sideways. Lily was listed there, but not where she should have been. Instead of showing up as my full sister, she was marked as unexpected relationship, possible half-sibling. Like we were genetic strangers who happened to grow up in the same house. My brain did that thing where it stops processing information for a few seconds. Like when you're driving and suddenly realize you don't remember the last 5 miles. The words were there on the screen, but they might as well have been written in hieroglyphics. Possible half-sibling. 3 words that somehow managed to rewrite 35 years of family history. I clicked refresh, thinking maybe the website had glitched. Maybe their servers were having a bad day, or maybe I'd accidentally logged into someone else's account. But the results stayed the same. According to science, Lily and I only shared one parent. But then I saw something else. A notification I'd somehow missed in my initial confusion. You have a new close relative. The link led to a profile with a photo of a guy I'd never seen before. Mid-30s, dark hair. Wearing a baseball cap that looked exactly like the one sitting on my bookshelf, the one Dad had given me for my 16th birthday. His name was Ethan. According to the website's algorithm, he was my half-brother. I stared at that photo until my eyes started to water. This stranger who supposedly shared my DNA, who had my eyes and Dad's jawline, who was wearing a baseball cap identical to mine, like we were part of some cosmic joke nobody had bothered to explain. The room suddenly felt smaller. My chair seemed to be sinking into quicksand, and that half-dead plant in the corner looked like it was wilting in real time. Every family photo on my desk was staring back at me with new questions hidden behind familiar smiles. Sometimes the biggest revelations come disguised as the smallest details. A nervous napkin fold, a forced laugh, a DNA test that was supposed to be entertainment. The thing about family secrets is they're like a pilot light gone out in winter. You don't notice until the cold hits. Somewhere down the hall, Dad's old brass clock ticked, 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 each beat landing heavier than the last, like it was marking time for something I didn't want to meet. A chill spread from my chest to my fingertips as the phone slipped slightly in my sweaty hands. This wasn't a joke anymore. This was a countdown, and I was holding the detonator. You know that feeling when you're reading a book you've loved for years, and suddenly you realize pages are missing? That you've been filling in the gaps with your own imagination, but the real story was completely different? That's what the next 3 days felt like. Except the book was my life, and I was just figuring out I'd been reading it wrong for 35 years. I didn't sleep that Tuesday night. By 3 in the morning, I felt like a hacker in my own life, refreshing that ancestry website like I was checking lottery numbers, hoping the results would somehow change. I'd screenshot everything, the percentages, the relationship addictions, that photo of Ethan wearing Dad's baseball cap, like some kind of cosmic joke. I even created a folder on my desktop labeled Family Research, which felt both official and completely insane. The more I stared at those results, the more questions started crawling out of the woodwork, like termites you never knew were there. If Lily was only my half-sister, which parent did we share? And why had nobody ever mentioned that I had a brother named Ethan walking around somewhere? Most importantly, how do you casually bring up genetic betrayal over morning coffee? I practiced conversation in my bathroom mirror while brushing my teeth. Hey, Lily. Funny story. Turns out we might only be half-siblings according to this DNA test. Or maybe, so, remember that ancestry thing Grandma made us do? Well, we need to talk. Everything sounded either too casual or too dramatic, like I was either announcing a pizza delivery or declaring war. Finally, around lunchtime Wednesday, I decided to rip the Band-Aid off. I texted Lily, "Promise you won't be mad, but we need to talk." 3 dots appeared immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again. It's amazing how those 3 little dots can make your heart rate spike like you're about to get fired or dumped. Her response came 5 minutes later. That's never a good way to start conversation. What did you do? I stared at that message for a solid minute. What did I do? I took a DNA test that blew up our family tree. That's what I did. So I called her. Lily picked up on the second ring, and I could hear that edge in her voice that she gets when she thinks someone's about to mess with her day. She was probably at work, trying to manage whatever crisis was happening at her marketing firm while dealing with her neurotic brother, calling with mysterious, urgent conversations. I dove right in, explaining about the DNA results, about the unexpected relationship label, about Ethan. The words tumbled out like I was confessing to a crime I didn't know I'd committed. The silence on the other end stretched. So long, I thought the call had dropped. Then she laughed. Not a happy laugh. One of those bitter, hollow sounds that people make when they're choosing between laughing and screaming. She told me she'd gotten the same results. She'd been staring at them for 2 days, wondering if she was losing her mind or if our entire childhood had been built on quicksand. She'd taken screenshots, too. She'd even Googled DNA test accuracy and false positive siblings, like we were both amateur detectives trying to solve our own lives. We compared notes like we were planning a heist instead of confronting our parents. That's when we decided to call Mom. Sarah picked up the phone with her usual cheerful mom voice, asking about work and whether we were eating enough vegetables. Normal mom stuff. But when Lily mentioned the DNA test results, something shifted in her tone. It was like watching someone's face change when they realized they'd been caught in a lie they'd forgotten they told. She got quiet, then defensive. Then she said she had to go because she had a doctor's appointment she'd forgotten about. At 2 in the afternoon, on a Wednesday. Mom's never forgotten a doctor's appointment in her life. The call ended with this awkward goodbye that felt like closing a door you weren't sure you'd be able to open again. Lily and I sat in silence for a moment, both of us processing the same uncomfortable truth. Our mother had just lied to us. Badly. And if she was lying about having a doctor's appointment, what else was she lying about? That night, our family group chat lit up with one of those conversations that seems normal on the surface, but feels loaded with subtext. Dad was sharing photos from a job site. Mom was sending article links about healthy recipes. Grandma Helen was doing her usual commentary on everything from the weather to why nobody makes good apple pie anymore. Then, like a digital bomb dropping into our cozy family chat, Grandma posted something that made my blood run cold. Truth is like water. It always finds a way to seep through. The message sat there for maybe 30 seconds before she deleted it. But Lily and I both saw it. We both screenshot it. And we both knew it wasn't random grandma wisdom. It was a warning, or maybe a confession, or maybe both. Suddenly, every family memory started feeling like evidence in a case I didn't know I was building. Remember how Dad always got weird when people asked about Lily's baby pictures? How he'd change the subject, or suddenly need another beer? I'd always thought he was just being typical dad awkward about his little girl growing up. Now I was wondering if there was another reason he didn't like looking at those photos. And Mom. God, Mom had always been a family historian, keeping photo albums organized by year, remembering everyone's birthdays, telling stories about when we were little. But now I was realizing she always told the same stories. The safe ones. The ones that didn't require too much detail about timing or circumstances. I started doing math in my head. Lily was born in March 1991. I was born in September 1988. If one of us had a different father, the timeline could work either way. But which one of us was the genetic outlier? And why had it been kept secret for over 30 years? Walking through my apartment that evening, I noticed something I'd never paid attention to before. A hairline crack running along the wall above my kitchen window. It was so thin you'd miss it unless you were looking for imperfections. But once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. That's when it hit me. The worst part wasn't even the potential deception. It was realizing how carefully constructed our family narrative had been. Every story, every tradition, every shared memory suddenly felt like it might be part of some elaborate performance designed to hide the truth. We weren't a family. We were actors who'd been given scripts we didn't know we were reading. Thursday morning, I got a message on the Ancestry website from Ethan. The notification made my hands shake like I was about to defuse a bomb. His profile picture was still that photo of him in the baseball cap, and seeing it again felt like looking at a funhouse mirror version of myself. His message was simple. Looks like we have some shared history to figure out. I'm ready to talk about it in person, if you are. I stared at that message for 20 minutes. This stranger, who was apparently my half-brother, wanted to meet. He was ready to share whatever secrets had been buried in our family tree. But was I ready to hear them? There's something devastating about discovering that your normal wasn't actually normal, that the foundation you built your entire identity on might be made of cardboard and good intentions. The photo that got to me the most was one from my parents' 20th wedding anniversary. They're standing in our backyard, arms around each other, smiling like they're sharing a private joke. Dad's wearing his favorite flannel shirt, the one he'd had since college. Mom's hair is shorter than it is now, and she's wearing that blue dress she always said made her feel beautiful. They look happy, genuinely, completely happy. But now I was wondering if that happiness was built on promises to keep certain secrets buried, if their love story was missing chapters that would explain why my DNA didn't match my sister's, and why I had a brother named Ethan walking around with Dad's face and my jawline. I picked up the photo, turning it over to read Mom's careful handwriting on the back. Mike and Sarah, 20 years of forever love. Some promises are worth keeping. Some promises are worth keeping. What kind of promises had they made to each other? And what kind of secrets were they keeping to honor them? The thing about family secrets is they're like cracks in a foundation. You can paint over them, hang pictures to cover them up, pretend they don't exist. But eventually, the weight of the house above makes them spread. And once they start spreading, everything starts to shift. Lily called me that evening, and her voice sounded as hollow as mine felt. She'd been doing the same thing, questioning every certainty, wondering how we could have been so blind to whatever was happening right in front of us. We talked about calling Dad directly, demanding answers, forcing the truth out of hiding. But something held us back. Maybe it was fear of what we'd find. Maybe it was the knowledge that once certain words are spoken, you can't take them back. Or maybe we both knew that Ethan held pieces of the puzzle we needed before we could confront the people who'd been keeping it from us. That night, I sat in my living room, surrounded by 35 years of family history, and realized I didn't know which parts were real and which parts were performance. How do you reconcile loving someone with not trusting them? How do you hold on to the good memories while questioning their foundation? How do you move forward when you're not sure which version of your own story is true? I thought about Grandma Helen's deleted message about truth finding a way to seep through. Maybe she was right. Maybe secrets have their own gravity, pulling everything toward revelation, whether you're ready for it or not. As I sat there in the dark, holding a photo of my parents' happiness and a phone containing messages from a brother I'd never known existed, I could almost feel that crack in my kitchen wall spreading invisible fingers through the entire structure of everything I thought I knew. We'd all thought we were living in this beautiful, solid castle built from love and shared history and family traditions. But it turned out we'd been performing on a stage set all along. And somewhere in the distance, I could hear the soft creak of curtains beginning to rise, revealing whatever truth had been waiting in the wings all these years. You know that moment in disaster movies when everyone's sitting around the table trying to pretend everything's normal, but you can see the cracks spreading across the walls? That's exactly what Friday night felt like when we all gathered in Mom and Dad's dining room, the same room where Grandma Helen had dropped her DNA bomb just 2 weeks earlier. Except this time, nobody was joking about being French royalty. The air felt thick, like right before a thunderstorm when your ears start popping and every dog in the neighborhood goes quiet. Mom had set the table with her good china, the stuff she usually saved for Thanksgiving and Christmas, which should have been a nice gesture, but instead felt like she was preparing for a funeral. Dad was doing that thing he does when he's nervous, rearranging the salt and pepper shakers like they were chess pieces in some game only he understood. His weathered hands kept fidgeting with everything, his napkin, his coffee cup, the edge of his flannel shirt. I'd seen him calmer when the foundation of a house literally collapsed under his crew. Lily arrived 20 minutes late, which was unusual for her. She's normally the type who shows up early and helps set the table. But she walked in looking like she'd rather be getting root canal surgery. Her dark hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, wearing this oversized sweater that seemed designed to help her disappear. We made small talk for exactly 7 minutes. I know, because I was watching the clock above the mantel, the same one that had been ticking away secrets in our family for decades. Dad asked about my latest insurance claims. Mom wanted to know if Lily was eating enough vegetables. Lily complimented the meatloaf that nobody was really eating. It was like watching actors who'd forgotten their lines trying to improvise their way through a scene they didn't want to be in. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled out my phone and set it in the middle of the table like I was playing the world's most uncomfortable trump card. The screen showed those ancestry results that had been burning a hole in my brain for 3 days. Unexpected relationship. Possible half-sibling glowed like a neon sign, announcing the end of everything we thought we knew about ourselves. Mom's fork clattered against her plate. Dad stopped mid-chew and just stared at the phone like it might explode if he looked away. The silence stretched so long I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, that old Kenmore that Dad kept saying he was going to replace but never did. Then Mom started crying. Not the pretty kind of crying you see in movies, the ugly, gut-wrenching kind that sounds like something breaking inside your chest. She kept saying they'd try to protect us, that they'd never meant for us to find out this way, that some secrets were meant to stay buried. Her mascara was running in dark streaks down her cheeks, and she kept wiping her nose with a cloth napkin that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. But Lily wasn't having any of it. She wanted answers. Real ones. Not the sugar-coated explanations adults give kids when they think the truth is too complicated. That's when things got ugly. Dad slammed his hand on the table so hard the water glasses jumped. He told Mom this was exactly what he'd been afraid of, that her guilt was going to destroy everything they'd built together. His voice cracked on the word everything. And for the first time in my life, I saw my father look genuinely scared. Mom fired back with 35 years of buried resentment. She carried this burden alone, while he'd chosen willful blindness over facing the truth. The words flew between them like shrapnel from a bomb nobody wanted to acknowledge had gone off. I sat there watching my parents destroy each other with sentences that carried the weight of decades, and all I could think was how lies really are like old paint. They crack and peel over time, but what's underneath is usually so much uglier than what you tried to cover up. Lily was gripping her water glass so hard I thought it might shatter in her hands. Her knuckles were white, and she had this look on her face like she was trying to solve a math problem that kept changing every time she got close to an answer. The worst part wasn't even what they were saying to each other. It was realizing that this fight had probably been happening in whispered conversations and meaningful looks for my entire life, that the tension I'd sometimes felt between them, the way Dad would sometimes stare out the window during family dinners, the way Mom would get this distant look when certain songs came on the radio, it had all been connected to secrets I was only now starting to understand. Dad kept running his hands through his graying hair, making it stick up in ways that would normally make us laugh. But nothing about this was funny. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, like each word Mom spoke was adding years to his face. Mom was clutching a tissue like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to reality. Her carefully applied lipstick was smeared, and she kept looking between Lily and me like she was trying to memorize our faces before we disappeared forever. The dining room that had hosted so many birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday nights suddenly felt like a courtroom, where everyone was both judge and defendant. The silence that followed was different from the uncomfortable quiet at the beginning of dinner. This was the kind of silence that comes after explosions, when the dust is still settling and everyone's ears are ringing. You could hear the old house settling around us, the refrigerator's hum, even the tick of that mantel clock that had witnessed decades of family secrets. The tension hung in the air like static before lightning strikes. I could feel my own pulse in my ears, and even my breath felt too loud in the stillness. That's when the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the silence like a fire alarm going off during a funeral service. We all froze, looking at each other like deer caught in headlights, wondering who could possibly be interrupting this family implosion. Dad wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and stood up slowly, like his joints had aged 20 years in the past hour. Mom tried to fix her makeup with shaking fingers. Lily and I just sat there, suspended in this moment between our old life and whatever was about to walk through that front door. I followed Dad to the entryway, partly because I was curious and partly because I couldn't stand sitting at that table any longer with the wreckage of our family conversation scattered around us like broken dishes. Dad opened the door, and there he was, Ethan, standing on our front porch like he'd been there 100 times before, holding a baseball cap in his hands. Not just any baseball cap. The exact same Cubs hat that Dad had given me for my 16th birthday, the one that was sitting on my bookshelf at home. He was taller than I'd expected from his photos, maybe 6'2", with the same dark hair as Dad and the same stubborn jawline that I saw in the mirror every morning. But his eyes were different. They had this weight to them, like they'd seen things that had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with years. He looked at me first, and I saw a recognition flash across his face. Then his gaze moved past me to where Dad was standing, and something shifted in his expression. Not anger, exactly. More like resignation mixed with determination. He nodded at Dad like they were acquaintances meeting at a coffee shop, rather than father and son seeing each other for the first time in decades. Then he looked back at me and said something that made my stomach drop to the floor. "I think everyone needs to hear what I have to say." His voice was calm, controlled, but there was an edge to it that suggested this conversation had been a long time coming. He wasn't here to make friends or have some heartwarming reunion. He was here to set the record straight, whatever that record was. Behind me, I could hear Mom sharpen take a breath from the dining room. Lily's chair scraped against the hardwood floor as she stood up. The whole house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for whatever bombshell was about to drop. Ethan stepped into our entryway like he belonged there, like he'd been coming to family dinners his whole life, instead of being the family secret nobody talked about. He set his baseball cap on the little table by the front door, right next to Mom's car keys and Dad's reading glasses, and somehow that simple gesture made everything feel surreal. This stranger who shared my DNA was standing in my childhood home, about to blow up whatever remained of the life I thought I'd been living. Dad's face had gone completely pale, like all the blood had drained out of it and pooled somewhere around his work boots. His hands were trembling slightly, and he kept opening and closing his mouth like he wanted to say something, but couldn't remember how words worked. From the dining room, I could hear Mom crying again, but quieter now, like she was trying to muffle the sound with her hands. The clink of china suggested she was either cleaning up or breaking down, possibly both. Lily appeared in the doorway behind me, and when she saw Ethan, she froze like someone had pressed pause on her entire existence. I watched her eyes move from his face to the baseball cap on the table and back again, and I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she tried to process what this meant for all of us. The four of us, Dad, Ethan, Lily, and me, stood there in this weird tableau, like characters in a play waiting for someone to remember their next line. But Ethan wasn't waiting for anyone. He looked around at all of us, taking in Dad's obvious distress, Mom's muffled sobs in the other room, and the general atmosphere of a family that had just imploded. And he nodded like this was exactly what he'd expected to find. Then he looked directly at Dad and said, "I think it's time everyone knew the truth about what really happened." The weight of those words settled over the house like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge was burning. This wasn't going to be some gentle family reunion where everyone hugged and cried happy tears and learned to love each other despite their differences. This was going to be a reckoning. Standing there in that entryway, looking at the stranger who had my father's eyes and my stubborn chin, clutching a baseball cap that connected him to a history I'd never known existed, I felt like I was watching pages from our family script scatter across the floor in slow motion, caught by an unseen draft that threatened to carry them away before anyone could gather them up again. In that moment, I realized we'd stopped being a family. We'd become characters in someone else's drama, and our lines were about to be completely rewritten. You know that moment in a thriller when the detective thinks they've solved the case, but then the real killer walks into the room? That's what it felt like standing in our entryway, looking at Ethan with his baseball cap and his calm determination to blow up whatever remained of our family's carefully constructed lies. What I didn't expect was how methodical he'd be about it, like a surgeon making precise incisions, knowing exactly where to cut to cause the most damage. We all moved back to the dining room, like sleepwalkers. Mom had stopped crying, but her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. Dad kept his hands shoved deep in his pockets, staring at the floor like he was trying to memorize the pattern in the hardwood. Lily sat down hard in her chair, and I could hear the springs creak under the weight of whatever revelation was coming. Ethan remained standing. He looked around the room, at the family photos on the walls, the china cabinet with Mom's wedding dishes, the mantel clock that had been ticking away our secrets for decades, and I could see him cataloging every detail like a crime scene investigator. Then he started talking. He told us he'd grown up in Phoenix with his mom, knowing that his father lived somewhere in Ohio, but had chosen not to be part of his life. Not because he didn't know Ethan existed, but because he'd made a conscious decision to walk away. Dad's face went white as paper. His weathered hands started shaking, and he had to grab the back of a chair to steady himself. But that wasn't the bomb Ethan had come to drop. He looked directly at Lily, and something in his expression shifted. Not cruel, but not gentle either, like a doctor about to deliver terminal news to someone who still thought they had the flu. He told her that her biological father wasn't Dad either, but it wasn't some random affair or one-night mistake. It was Dad's best friend from high school, a guy named Tommy who'd been part of their construction crew, who'd been at their wedding, who'd been Uncle Tommy to me growing up until he died in a work accident when I was 12. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat. Lily's face went through about 5 different expressions in the span of 10 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, understanding, and then something that looked like her entire world cracking apart in real time. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just sat there with this empty look in her eyes, like someone had reached inside her head and unplugged something essential. Mom finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She said it had happened during a rough patch in her relationship with Dad, before they were married, that Tommy had been there for her when Dad wasn't ready to commit, that she'd found out she was pregnant and made a choice to let Dad believe the baby was his because she loved him and wanted their family to work. Dad's response was like watching a dam break in slow motion. He looked at Mom with eyes full of 35 years of hurt and said something that cut through all of us like a blade. I wanted so badly for our fairy tale to be real, but I can't pretend anymore. That's when Lily finally broke, not with tears or shouting, but with this sound that came from somewhere deep in her chest, like something fundamental had snapped inside her. She doubled over in her chair, her hands pressed against her stomach, making these awful gasping noises like she couldn't get enough air. I moved to her without thinking, kneeling beside her chair and taking her hand. It was ice cold and trembling, and I could feel her pulse racing under my thumb. Ethan was still standing there, watching our family disintegrate, and for a moment I hated him for being the messenger who delivered this particular apocalypse. But then I looked at his face and saw something I recognized, the same expression I'd been wearing for the past week, the look of someone whose entire understanding of reality had been rearranged without their permission. That's when Grandma Helen chose to make her entrance. She'd been sitting in her car in the driveway, Ethan told us later, waiting for the right moment to come in, like she was directing this whole drama from the wings, and knew exactly when each actor needed to appear on stage. She walked into our dining room like she owned the place, which I guess in a way she did. She'd been keeping these secrets longer than any of us had been alive. She looked around at the wreckage of our family dinner and said something that made everything else seem small by comparison. The children deserved to know their own story. Not an apology, not an explanation. Just a simple statement of fact delivered with the kind of certainty that comes from 7 decades of making hard decisions and living with the consequences. The conversation that followed felt like watching a slow-motion car crash. Mom admitted she'd been sending money to Ethan through Grandma Helen for years. Dad admitted he'd sat in his truck outside Ethan's high school graduation, too scared to go inside but unable to stay away. By the time the conversation wound down, it was past midnight. Ethan said he had a hotel room and would call tomorrow. Grandma Helen kissed everyone goodbye like nothing had happened and drove home in her ancient Buick. Mom and Dad sat opposite ends of the couch, not touching, looking like survivors of some natural disaster trying to figure out what was left standing. Lily sat there staring at her hands, occasionally taking these shaky breaths that made me worry she was going to hyperventilate. I looked around that dining room, at the family photos that now seemed like elaborate fiction, at the china cabinet full of wedding dishes, celebrating a marriage built on secrets, at all of us sitting in the wreckage of everything we thought we knew, and realized we weren't a family anymore. We were pieces of a puzzle that someone had tried to force together, and now we could finally see that none of us had ever really fit. I drove everyone home through streets, so quiet you could hear the traffic lights changing colors. When I finally got back to my own apartment, I sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes, listening to the engine cool and tick in the darkness, not ready to go inside and pretend this was just another Thursday night. The silence felt different now. Not peaceful, but hollow, like the absence of something that had been holding the world together. The thing about family explosions is that life keeps going afterward. You still have to go to work, pay bills, get your oil changed, pretend that finding out your entire family history was built on well-intentioned lies hasn't fundamentally altered your understanding of reality. We were broken, but we were learning to put the pieces back together in new configurations. Like a jigsaw puzzle that had been assembled wrong the first time, and now we were trying to figure out what the picture was supposed to look like all along. Lily and I started having lunch every Tuesday, not to talk about the family drama. We'd had enough of that to last several lifetimes, but to figure out how to be siblings when the definition of siblings had gotten a lot more complicated. She'd started therapy, which she approached with the same methodical determination she brought to her marketing campaigns. Every week she'd report her progress, like she was updating me on quarterly sales figures. It was very Lily, and somehow reassuring in its normalcy. I'd been getting to know Ethan, which was like looking into a funhouse mirror version of my own life. He'd grown up with the same stubborn streak and tendency to overthink everything, but without the safety net of pretending everything was fine. Dad had started reaching out to him, tentatively, like someone trying to pet a stray dog that might bite or might let you feed it. It was painful to watch, but also hopeful in a way that surprised me. Mom and Dad were taking it one day at a time, which seemed to be about all any of us could handle. The weird thing was how normal everything felt most of the time, like we'd just rearranged the furniture in a familiar room, and eventually our muscle memory would adjust to where the couch used to be. But then there would be moments when the weight of everything that had changed would hit me all at once, and I'd have to sit down and remind myself how to breathe. I was having one of those moments when Lily called me on a Thursday afternoon in March. Her voice had this edge to it that I'd learned to recognize over the past few months. The sound of someone who just discovered another piece of the puzzle they didn't know they were trying to solve. She said something had been bothering her ever since that night. Something Ethan had mentioned during one of our family dinners about how Tommy used a joke that he and Dad looked nothing alike, despite being best friends since childhood. How he'd always said Lily had gotten the best features from both sides of the family, even though that never quite made sense. It had been nagging at her, she said. So she started thinking about DNA testing companies and how they were always updating their algorithms as their databases grew. How sometimes people got notifications about updated results or new relatives they hadn't known about. So she logged back into the Ancestry website just to see if anything had changed. Something had changed. She didn't want to talk about it over the phone. Could I meet her at that coffee shop downtown, the one with the uncomfortable chairs, and a barista who always spelled everyone's name wrong? I told her I'd be there in 20 minutes. She was already sitting at our usual table when I arrived, and I could tell immediately that whatever she'd found was big. She had that look people get when they're trying to decide whether to laugh or cry, and aren't sure which option would be more appropriate. The coffee shop was busy with the usual afternoon crowd, the espresso machine hissing and grinding in the background like it was trying to drown out serious conversations. The smell of freshly roasted beans mixed with burnt milk and artificial vanilla syrup created this weird domestic soundtrack to what I could tell was about to be another life-altering moment. She'd printed out the updated results and spread them across the small table like evidence in a criminal investigation. Steam rose from her untouched latte, curling up around the cold, clinical DNA percentages printed on white paper. This bizarre collision of warmth and harsh scientific facts. The numbers and relationships looked mostly the same, but there was one addition that made my stomach drop. According to the latest analysis, the man we'd all believed was her biological father. Uncle Tommy, Dad's best friend who died when we were kids, wasn't her father either. The website now listed him as no genetic relationship detected, which meant that for the past 3 months, we'd all been operating under yet another set of incorrect assumptions about who Lily really was and where she'd come from. She looked at me across that small table, surrounded by the evidence of another family secret unraveling, with the coffee grinder creating the surreal soundtrack to our conversation, and said something that perfectly captured the absurdity of our situation. Looks like we only opened the first door, and there's a whole maze behind it. I stared at the paper spread between us, at the DNA percentages that kept rearranging themselves like a Rubik's Cube that refused to be solved, and felt something shift in my chest. For months, I'd been thinking of this whole thing as a disaster that had happened to our family, something we needed to survive and move past. But sitting there looking at Lily's face, excited and terrified and determined all at once, I realized something that changed everything. We weren't brother and sister anymore, at least not in the traditional sense. We weren't even sure what we were to each other, genetically speaking, but we were partners now. 2 people who'd been handed the same impossible mystery and had decided to solve it together, no matter how deep the rabbit hole went or how many more family secrets were waiting to be uncovered. In that moment, I realized we were detectives standing at the threshold of the biggest case of our lives, and we were both ready to see it through to the end.